The story of the Transfiguration is a key event in the life and the ministry of Jesus. It's critical enough that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three amigos, they all recorded basically the same story. Which is not surprising because we already know Matthew pretty much couldn't keep his eyes on his own paper. 90% of what Mark wrote appears in Matthew's gospel. But also Luke was pretty much in the same boat because 80% of what Mark wrote ended up in Luke's gospel. But the point is that all three of them chose to report this particular incident, what we call the Transfiguration. And there's some thought that even the Gospel of John makes an oblique reference to it in John chapter 1, verse 14, where it says, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So it's possible to read the Transfiguration into that. But it's hard to know for sure. But we know for sure at least three of the Gospels felt it very important. What's maybe not so clear is why was it important? In a gospel that is filled with miracles, healings, exorcisms, people rising from the dead, with all of those miracles, why does this one stand out enough that it gets mentioned in the three synoptic gospels, and it even gets its own day on the church calendar? It's today's Transfiguration Sunday. So we're going to look at that a little bit. But to start to appreciate why it is so important, I think we need to read something else first to give it context. First of all, I like context. But second of all, the more we know about Jesus, the more we learn about the things that he taught, the proclamations that he made, we know that Jesus is also all about context. He's all about saying things and preaching and doing things that fit into the context of both the contemporary times in which he and his followers lived and their own social and cultural history, but also in the context of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, what they call the law and the prophets. Jesus did everything he could to connect what he did to those books. And by doing that, he gave what he did a resonance that we just can't appreciate from a distance. And that, I think, is one of the reasons we struggle sometimes in making sense of what he said and did and understanding the importance of what he said and did. So we want to look at Exodus 34. And it's important to remember this is around 1,200 or 1,300 years before the time of Jesus. This is the time of the Exodus. The Old Testament reading we had just a few minutes ago was from this same time. This is the time after the Israelites have fled Egypt, but before they got to the land of milk and honey, so they are out in the wilderness. They are still in the process of being molded and formed into what we would come to know as the children of Israel. And in this particular passage, Moses once again ascends Mount Sinai. He's going to have a sit-down meeting with God. And up there on the mountain, hidden in clouds, Moses receives the law, and it's handed directly to him from God. That's the second time. First time didn't go too well. This is the second time. Let that roll around in your head for just a minute. Moses, called by God, goes up to the top of this mountain. And he meets with God. And God gives him organized do's and don'ts for his people. God himself gives Moses tablets that tell the people exactly what they should do, what they shouldn't do. It's an act of love from God. Because God's telling him, Moses, and Moses then is to turn around and tell the people exactly how they are to live their lives so they can be in complete harmony with one another and with God's creation and with God. So here, Exodus 34, beginning at verse 29. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken to the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. And afterward, all of the Israelites came near to him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in again to speak with the Lord. So that phrase gets repeated several times. They see that his face is glowing. And now, just over 1,000 years after that, as Jesus is on the cusp of fulfilling that same law, as Jesus has had his prayer time up on the mountain and he's looking at what he is about to do, what he's about to go through. When Jesus is contemplating the idea that he is going to now fulfill the law in all righteousness in a way that no other human being could possibly do, Jesus is very consciously echoing what happened on Mount Sinai. Because he too glows. No member of the Jewish community with even a passing knowledge of history at that time could fail to connect the significance of Moses glowing in glory from having talked to God, from being in the presence of God. They could not fail to connect that with Jesus glowing in glory during his special moment on the mountain. They could not possibly miss the significance of Jesus being lit up by the glory of God. And in that very moment, when that is happening, Jesus also encounters Moses and Elijah. Why them? Moses represents the law. Moses represents the escape of the people of Israel from the tyranny of this world, the escape from slavery and injustice. Moses is that connection to the very beginning of the real nation of Israel. And Elijah is the most significant prophet in the history of the people of Israel. He was the one who was going to, when he came back, and they predicted that he would. When he came back, that would signify that the time for the return of God himself was coming near. Elijah was there to represent that connection and to represent all of the prophets in their role in the history of people. If you could look back at the history of the Jewish people and pick any two of the most significant people, they would be it. His disciples could not escape noticing that. I tried to think of an equivalent. I was thinking about it this week. But watching the news, I realized there's an election this year. You might be aware of it. There's campaigning and all sorts of stuff going on. So, I want you to think of any candidate that you want. Doesn't really matter which candidate you choose. Then think of that candidate going off on a prayer retreat with a few of that candidate's staffers. And all of a sudden, during the course of that retreat, the candidate begins to glow with a glorious inner light. And then just as they see this candidate glowing, all of a sudden George Washington and Abraham Lincoln are standing next to the candidate, carrying on a conversation. And then, just in case you didn't get the message, imagine a voice from the sky saying, "Behold, the candidate I have chosen." That would make a great ad. Just saying. That would be pretty freaky if you were there. It would be pretty freaky and pretty obvious that this was the one. No question, this is the one we need to follow. There are not many times on earth when the interface between God and humanity is that obvious, when the message is that clear. But that's what happened. In the context of the moment, in reality, the message was perfectly clear. Jesus connected himself to the very heart of his people's relationship with God, to their very roots as a nation. Like Moses before him, Jesus has come close enough to God that the glory of God has caused these physical manifestations. Almost as though the divine light of love and grace was too powerful to be contained, and it ends up being reflected in the face of Jesus. And the reflection of that light, that glory, is what's there to light our way out of the darkness. So think of all that. All of that makes it almost incomprehensible that when the glow finally fades, Jesus turns to Peter, John, and James and says, "Shh. Don't tell anyone about this. Don't tell anybody what you saw. Keep quiet until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Then you're free to tell anyone." It's a curious warning. Now, scholars that I've been reading seem to think that it's really a matter of timing, because what Jesus is probably saying is, look, don't muddy the waters by telling people what you just saw now, because something even more important is about to happen. So wait until after that, and then tell them. But could you imagine being one of the three, being Peter, John, or James, and seeing this happen, and then being told you had to keep quiet? Couldn't even tell your friends? You got to wonder, would that be a secret? One of those secrets that you've got that you're just bursting to tell? One of those great truths that is straining to be free? Or maybe was it such a wild experience that it really wasn't that hard at all to keep quiet? Because who wants to hear their friends talking behind their back saying, "Hey, did you hear what Peter thought he saw the other day?" But after the full truth was known, it would be an entirely different story, wouldn't it? After Jesus came back from the dead, people probably wouldn't have a very hard time at all believing what had happened on the mountain. I think it would have been hard. But now to circle back to where we started all this, about the significance. We know that it was a significant event from the way it is treated. But it was significant then. Is it old news now? Is it just of historical interest, or was there some significance to it that gives it contemporary significance as well? What's the big deal? Maybe the significance today is the same as it was 2,000 years ago. That Jesus was transfigured. He was visibly transformed by his encounter with God. As he stood there on the mountain contemplating that last lap of what he had to do, looking ahead to the betrayal, the torture, the death, the unknown. Even though he had faith in his own resurrection, knowing what had to come first had to be scaring him to death. In that moment, he was blessed to encounter Moses and Elijah. And he was blessed by the presence of God, to be overwhelmed by the presence of God, so that he reflected the sheer glory of that divine encounter. He was changed. Jesus himself was changed by his encounter with the kingdom of heaven as it manifested up there on the mountain. Which leads us to the question, are we changed when we encounter God? In those divine moments when we find ourselves in the presence of the inexplicable, we find ourselves in the presence of God's grace. Even if it's John Wesley's sudden warmth and knowledge that he personally had been redeemed by God, does that change us? I hope so. I hope that in those moments of understanding, we realize how blessed we really are. Because if we realize it, we can reflect those blessings on other people. If we realize how lucky we are to be followers of Christ, and we can reflect that on the world around us, and that is how hearts are won, and lives are changed, and people are brought into relationship with God. So let's leave here today with a promise. A promise to ourselves and a promise to one another. That through Jesus Christ, we will seek transformation in our hearts and in our minds. And that by that transformation, that will change our lives so that we can then go out and change others' lives. For the transformation of the world, the greater glory of God.